This is a Unit 1 revision video on Key Topic 2, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, so background to the Cuban Missile Crisis is the arms race again. Fundamentally, the US could accurately target the USSR, and this was because of American nuclear missiles placed in Western Europe. So West Germany, Britain, Turkey, Italy. So not only did the Americans have an advantage in terms of the number of weapons they had, but they could use them accurately. They could target specific cities in the USSR, like Moscow, for example. Whereas the Soviets could launch intercontinental ballistic missiles, but they couldn't really know exactly where they were going to land. They were just aiming for the USA. So up until the late 1950s, America is the clear winner in this arms race. But then something changes, because in 1957 it's the Soviets that make the first breakthrough in space when they launch Sputnik 1. And this is the world's first man-made satellite. And they followed this up reasonably quickly in 1960 by landing a robotic spacecraft on the moon. And this had a big impact on the Americans. They feel that they've got to respond to this, and they increased spending on missiles by 20%. They also set up NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, because they want to be the ones getting ahead in the space race. So the arms race sort of shifts to the space race, because it's such an unknown. The Americans feel that the Soviets might be able to use it to their advantage. That this Russian technology, Sputnik 1 and the robotic spacecraft, if they can put satellites into space, then could those same satellites be used to launch nuclear missiles, at the USA? So that is the background to all of this. Now, up until 1959, Cuba and the USA had traditionally been allies. Cuba lies about 90 miles away from the USA. Much of the land there was owned by American businesses and American companies around the phone and electricity supplies. They owned half the railways. They had a big influence there. And in 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew the pro-American government on Cuba under Batista. He's a revolutionary leader, he's left-wing, and he wants greater independence from the USA. So that changes the entire relationship between Cuba and the USA. Now, Castro tried to see President Eisenhower in the January of 1959, but he refused to see him, and he'd made it clear that as part of his revolution he was going to nationalise businesses and he was going to nationalise land in Cuba. He wanted it to be owned by the Cubans. Now, other countries who own businesses and land accepted this and took payment for the land and for the businesses, but the Americans refused. In January 1960, the American land, American businesses are nationalised, and this creates a lot of tension with the Americans. And the Americans, they're not given payment for what is taken. Now, in response, the Americans boycott Cuban sugar, and this was one of the biggest trade links the Cubans had, so it's going to cause massive problems to the Cubans. So they're looking around for another market, and at this point Khrushchev steps in and offers to buy Cuban sugar, and in return they will sell Cuba Soviet oil. And at this point the US end diplomatic relations, so there's no conversations, no discussions going on between them. and they followed it up by banning all trade with Cuba. So all American businesses in Cuba are nationalised. Now, just before we get on to the Bay of Pigs, Khrushchev has specifically nurtured this relationship with Castro. He knows that Castro is a socialist, he's left-wing, he believes in many communist principles, but it's the geographical location of Cuba that makes it so appealing. And that is because it would allow the Soviets to target America accurately. Remember, the Americans have got all those bases in Western Europe. Cuba seems like a good place to establish a relationship. Now, the Bay of Pigs in January 1961 is an American-backed attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro. The CIA had tried to assassinate Castro several times and that hasn't worked, and the Americans do not want a communist country on their doorstep. They're worried that then communism might spread, into South America. So, the Bay of Pigs is an attempt by the Americans to overthrow Castro, and they're going to use Cuban exiles rather than American soldiers. So it looks like it's being led by Cubans, and they're going to disguise old US planes to look like Cuban ones, for bombing missions. They believe that Castro's hold on the country is weak, and that once this Bay of Pigs invasion is launched, that most people would join in and support the invasion. They got it totally wrong. Castro knew of the plan, even though it was supposed to be secret, and most Cubans did not want Batista, the pro-American previous leader, back. Now, the invasion was started with airstrikes on the 15th of April 1961, and this missed its main targets. And in response, a second airstrike was called off, and that was a crucial mistake. On the 17th of April, just under 1,500 Cuban exiles invaded. They faced heavy air attacks from the Cubans, and 20,000 of Castro's troops were there to stop them. By the time Kennedy sent in planes, it was too late, and the exiles had to surrender. It was basically a disaster, an embarrassment. Okay, it ended any chance of friendly negotiation. It ended with Castro saying, "I'm a communist." The USA began to think of new ways to overthrow Castro, and at this point the USSR were able to step in and say that they were able to provide military protection to Cuba against the USA. And in response, Soviet missiles are placed on Cuba to provide that protection. And obviously, Khrushchev is more than happy to do this because he feels it balances the fact that the USA have missiles in places like Turkey. And it also has economic benefits because they won't have to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles. They can use much shorter range ones, and the longer range ones are very, very expensive. So, the 25th of September 1962, Soviet ships head to Cuba carrying nuclear warheads and long-range missiles, and they have been building these missile bases since the end of 1961. Towards the end of 1962, so October time, Kennedy discovers these missile bases. They have spy planes flying over that take pictures, and they can see what is going on. So this is when the real crisis begins. In response, Kennedy imposes a naval blockade and basically tells the ships that if they come up to the naval blockade and don't turn around, there's going to be some sort of confrontation. He's got lots of soldiers on high alert. He has got nuclear-equipped submarines ready to go. The Air Force is, out patrolling the skies. He's been on television making speeches, and things look pretty dire. Now, When the Soviet ships approach the blockade, which is about 500 miles from Cuba, the ships do stop. They don't try and go through the blockade. But all communication at this point is, via letter. There's no face-to-face communication, no telephone communication. And a letter, which I'll call letter 1, was sent from Khrushchev's office to Kennedy's office. And Khrushchev states he will remove missiles in response to the US promise not to invade Cuba. So that seems, pretty clear what's going on. However, Khrushchev is then told that the US is planning an invasion in 24 hours. So he rethinks his demands. And he sends a second letter where he makes it clear that he will remove the missiles if the US removes its missiles from Turkey. And whilst these negotiations are going on, an American spy plane is shot down over Cuba, and there's American politicians known as hawks who are demanding retaliation, and things get incredibly tense. The world is expecting some sort of confrontation, nuclear confrontation. Now, in the end, the US accept the deal that Khrushchev puts forward as long as the removal of American missiles in Turkey is kept secret. Okay. So, what are the consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis? Well, if we start up at the top there, the first one is the creation of a hotline. Okay. So this hotline is to improve communications. They were sending letters to each other during this crisis. It was not the best way to deal with an imminent war. And this hotline would connect Moscow to Washington directly. Secondly, we've got the Limited Test Ban Treaty. And the USA and the USSR agreed to ban the testing of all nuclear weapons in space, in the sea and above ground. Only underground testing was permitted. So you can clearly see that they are trying to limit the damage caused by nuclear weapons and the testing process. That they realise there's got to be some sort of limitations here. In 1963 we get Kennedy's speech. This is June 1963, and he signals a change in approach, saying that the USA and the USSR should focus on their common interests. Now, the USSR makes a key decision that it's not going to lag behind the US in terms of the arms race. So it goes out of its way to catch up in terms of the number of nuclear weapons it's got, to catch up with the USA. And that results in mutually assured destruction. If they've both got exactly the same or very similar numbers of weapons, then it gave both powers an excellent reason for avoiding war. There's an equal footing, it provides stability, nobody's got an advantage. And that MAD did, it lasted until the early 1980s, and it kept a level of stability within the arms race. Another reaction was that France left NATO because they didn't want to feel obliged to fight alongside America in a nuclear war. This was very much an American-Soviet issue, but NATO could have been dragged into it, and France didn't want to be part of that. And the final one there is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was this idea that neither superpower would share information about nuclear weapons with other countries so that knowledge of nuclear weapons wouldn't spread. Again, an attempt to contain what was happening. Now, the final thing we need to be aware of is because the American missiles were removed in secret, that made Khrushchev look weak. This reduced his authority, and eventually he was forced to step down. So at the end of the day, Kennedy looks like the stronger man. Okay, some key things here. Top left is one of the photographs taken by the spy plane, okay, which was what triggered the 13 days crisis when the Americans have got the evidence that Khrushchev has been placing missiles on Cuba. So that was the mid-October of 1962. You can see the map they've created on the right showing, where they can target with these weapons on Cuba. Bottom right, there's a newspaper there, Kennedy orders blockade of Cuba. Bottom left, you have got Khrushchev and Castro, who were brought together by, America's response to Castro's revolution. And then a range of cartoons there that you can see, Kennedy and Khrushchev arms wrestling there, sitting on H-bombs, fingers pressed, ready to launch those bombs. You can see top left there, Castro with his teeth turned into missiles, and Khrushchev is removing them one by one. We've got Khrushchev sitting on Cuba, going fishing with a nuclear missile. And then over to the right again, Khrushchev and Kennedy trying to keep the monster that is nuclear war, inside the chest. Now, although the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the two countries probably the closest to nuclear war they've ever been, the long-term reaction to it was, we got really close to war there, and they start putting in place things that will limit the power of nuclear weapons. And this takes us into the next phase of the war, if you like, which is détente.